Since the middle of the 20th century, fear has been driving governments in West Africa to acquire more weapons. Fear for seats and positions, fear of rebels and neighbors, and even fear of the people. However, recent years have doubled the fear with the rise of terrorism, and the desire of these governments to acquire more weapons has doubled, so that the region has become one of the most important markets for which its traders compete. The weapon and its promoters. Mali, which 10 years ago by Al-Qaeda occupied large parts of its territory, and since that time has lived a fierce war to restore stability in vain, is now ruled by force of arms, officers, most of whom were born in the early 80s of the last century. Their supporters, the heroes who had courage, took the initiative and expelled the former French colonizer after he returned under the pretext of the War on Terror. But these officers, in fact, cancelled arms deals that would have been signed with the French, and headed towards Russia to conclude a military and security partnership, which, in just 2 years, enabled them to acquire military equipment and weapons that the Malian army had not dreamed of, with special services provided by the Russian Wagner Group, without to know the details of the deal, nor what poor Mali will pay for this weapon, but Moscow has certainly gained a foothold in the Sahel and West Africa, where the global war against terrorism has become centered, and where the active and promising arms market is located. In mid-April, Mali's transitional president, Colonel Assimi Goïta, and his powerful defense minister, Colonel Sadio Camara, sat near him to lead a huge celebration of the delivery of military helicopters and various weapons coming from Moscow. Russian Ambassador Igor Gromyko was present at their side, enjoying the sun. Burning Bamako, and proud of the appreciation he enjoys in a city built by the French at the beginning of the 20th century, when they were the masters of the country. Today Malians celebrate the ambassador of Moscow after they expelled the ambassador of Paris, and the last French soldier left their country. The Malians are not interested in the entry of their new leaders into a geostrategic conflict larger than their fragile and threatened state. Rather, they place a lot of hope on Russian weapons, in order to turn the balance of power in favor of their army in its war against the Al-Qaeda and ISIS organizations that control areas of the country. But this weapon would change the equation in the semi-region, as it ignited a silent arms race between Mali's neighbors, and they fear a repeat of the Libyan scenario, when Gaddafi's weapon fell more than 10 years ago, in the hands of terrorist and criminal groups, which ignited Libya and its neighbors in the African coast, a fire that continues to this day, but the circle of its flame is expanding and expanding. Initiating army. The young officers who rule Mali announced many promises from the beginning, but their biggest promise was to rebuild the army, so that it would be a proactive army and able to attack, instead of hiding and waiting for terrorist attacks to react after that, cold and slow. Their motto in that was Strong Rise. Under that slogan, they concluded their agreements with Russia, and Moscow's arms did not delay long. The Russian ambassador in Bamako has become more present in the local media, and often sends messages of reassurance to Malians. He spoke once, saying that Russia will spare no effort to enhance its cooperation with Mali, on the political, security and military levels, and no one will stand in the way of our friendship and brothers. Then he added, Russia will always stand by Mali to help it, and I am sure that Mali will for its part, it will help us. The biggest challenge for the new rulers of Mali was to achieve results on the ground, because that was the way to convince their people that replacing the Russians with the French was neither a mistake nor a reckless decision, and they are the ones who are paying dearly for their decision in the form of an economic and political blockade imposed by the West African countries allied with France. Indeed, results were quickly achieved on the ground, and the Malian army began launching effective attacks against Al-Qaeda and ISIS fighters, but this does not mean victory, because the terrorist groups have also changed their strategy and moved closer to the capital, Bamako, as Siddiq Abba confirms. He is a Nigerian journalist and writer residing in France, specializing in security and terrorism files in Africa. Siddiq Abba, who has written many books on security challenges in West Africa, the most famous of which is his book A Journey to the Depth of Boko Haram, said in an interview with Asharq Al-Azate that the bilateral cooperation between Mali and Russia has allowed the Malian authorities to obtain a lot of military equipment, including half a dozen Sukhoi helicopters, MiG-35 and MiG-21, and cargo planes for soldiers, as well as huge quantities of individual weapons, especially Kalashnikovs. Terrorist attacks. The Nigerian writer and journalist stressed that the Russian weapon enabled the Malian army to improve its mobility, to become more dynamic and effective, which changed some things in the field, as before military cooperation with Russia, the army was in a self-defense mode. Its units in the barracks were sufficient by repelling terrorist attacks, but never taking the initiative to attack, and since the Malians turned to military cooperation with Russia, and took tangible steps to develop this cooperation, especially with regard to air and intelligence capabilities, the Malian army began launching attacks against terrorist bases, and this in itself was a major change in the scales of confrontation on the field. The journalist who closely follows developments on the ground adds that the Malian army has achieved some positive results on the ground, in the form of victories in the center of the country, but the journalist expresses some reservations, noting that this improvement in the capabilities of the Malian army does not mean that the security situation in the Sahel region, it has changed for the better, because even if things improve in Mali, if this does not include the rest of the neighboring countries, the situation will always remain complicated. The improvement made by Russian weapons to the capabilities of the Malian army, and the presence of Wagner fighters alongside Malian soldiers, is still not enough to eliminate the hotbeds of terrorism. The security situation is very complicated in the country, as a few days ago we noticed that terrorist groups also achieved an expansion into new areas, and carried out attacks a few days ago in areas of Mali that were never within their sphere of influence, in the Kaoulikoro and Kai provinces, in the south of the country. In the same context, the second observation that we made recently is that terrorist groups carried out 6 simultaneous attacks in different cities, which has not happened before in Mali. Arms race. The model presented by Mali, when it abandoned the traditional partnership with the former French colonizer, and replaced it with the bosom of the Russian bear, draws the attention of the rest of the Sahel and West African countries who are watching the financial experience, and if things work out in Mali, the situation will be bad for the French. This is the idea defended by Mamadou Sawadogo, a security expert from Burkina Faso, who said in an interview with the Shark Al-Azate that he does not rule out the expansion of the Russian sphere of influence in West Africa. We can consider Mali as the gateway through which these weapons will enter the West African region. There are several countries monitoring the situation in Mali, and when tangible results are achieved on the ground and Russian weapons turn the equation, there is no doubt that these countries will follow the example of Bamako. However, the Burkinabe security expert adds, France has a strong influence in West Africa, where its former colonies are, and if it was taken by surprise in Mali, it is very vigilant now, and any country that thinks of taking the Mali route in the future will face strong pressures that will not be able to withstand it. But the Nigerian writer, who specializes in security and terrorism issues, Siddiq Abba, has another opinion. He says, I am not sure that the model adopted by the Malian authorities is of interest to the Sahel and West African countries. Siddiq Abba explains his opinion by saying, for example, Burkina Faso decided it is taking a different path, which is to rely on itself, so it formed special military units to combat terrorism, and repositioned them outside the capital, specifically in the areas most affected by the attacks. In the same context, he adds, Niger chose to strengthen its military and security partnership with France, and received more than 1,000 French soldiers who withdrew from Mali. Plan to buy it? Siddiq Abba asserts that each country has its own approach, and I do not think that there are countries in the semi-region that have imitated Mali in their partnership with Moscow, and I am almost certain of that, noting in the same context that Russian weapons are not strange to the Sahel region, although the talk about it has increased recently, but we know that Niger has previously acquired MiG helicopters from Moscow to fight the Tuareg rebellion, and there are large quantities of Russian weapons in the Sahel region, which played great roles in the rebellions and wars, and from here I can say that Russian weapons will not be part of the solution, nor any other weapon. The Nigerian writer expressed his concern about the silent arms race in West Africa, a race caused primarily by the desire of international powers to sell their weapons. It has further complicated the security situation, as it is sufficient to know that Nigeria, in order to confront the Boko Haram group, spent $1.3 billion on American weapons, during the rule of Donald Trump and the previous rule of Joe Biden. Weapons smuggling. In light of the growing concern about the silent arms race in West Africa, the Mauritanian researcher who specializes in African affairs, Mahfouz Ould Salek, believes that the situation is making Mali on the verge of a worse scenario, relying on the previous experiences of Russian weapons in Africa, and he explains in his interview with Sharq Al-Azate in comparison to some other African countries, which the Wagner Group entered and received Russian military support, such as Libya, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo and others, Mali is on the verge of a more dangerous scenario than expected. He added, in the same context, that the countries that had previously entered the Russian arms race in the global arms race are witnessing a great activity of arms smugglers, and this has opened other more dangerous security fronts, and arms have become a commercial activity and a profitable source of financing, from which even the armed groups themselves benefit, and so on. Instability is spreading to other safe countries, and this scenario is what is feared to be repeated in the Sahel region, after the growing Russian military presence in Mali. The Mauritanian researcher did not rule out that Mali would turn in the near future into a source of arms smuggling, and in this a great danger raises the concern of neighboring countries. Wagner is the first winner at the time. On the one hand, it benefits from arms trading and smuggling activity in the region, and on the other hand it benefits from the exploitation of natural financial resources, because the state budget in the medium term will not be able to provide the $10 million